The Aztec Empire is literally built on human flesh. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that you could be the god's breakfast. And it's not a metaphor. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, human sacrifices were a daily occurrence. But what's disturbing is that they weren't doing it for pleasure or madness. They did it to keep the sun from going out, literally. According to their worldview, the gods needed beating human hearts to keep the universe running. Without them, the sun would stop, the earth would die, and with it, all of us. But what began as a religious belief ended up as a sacrifice industry, one so massive that it would make the Roman Colosseum look like a playground. During the rededication of the Templo Mayor in 1487, it is said that they sacrificed 80,000 people in just 4 days, although some historians doubt the figure. Even the more moderate versions speak of about 20,000 per year. Anyway, something like that couldn't be spirituality. They were large-scale massacres, but the thing was only getting worse because the dead did not disappear quietly. After the horrible sacrificial ritual, their skulls were impaled one by one on structures called zompantli, true walls of bones that could hold tens of thousands of human heads. The largest recorded exceeded 100,000 skulls. It was a visual reminder of what happened if you dared to defy the empire. In Aztec warfare, contrary to popular belief, their goal was not to kill. The truly valuable thing was to capture enemies alive, because a prisoner was much more useful than a corpse. It was an offering, one with a name, a history, and a still beating heart. The warriors who managed to bring back more captives were treated as heroes. They rose in status, gained lands, and sometimes even wives. It was a system where the value of a man was measured by how many people he could deliver to the knife. And the ritual was something you could never forget. The victims were forced to climb the temple steps. 4 priests held them. A 5th, with a sharp obsidian knife, would open their chest and tear out the heart. Still warm, still beating, the body was thrown down the stairs, hitting stone after stone until it lay lifeless at the foot of the temple. And that was just the beginning. Some bodies were skinned. Their skin was used as ceremonial clothing by the priests. Others were dismembered and their bones turned into relics. But not everything went to waste. There was ritual cannibalism. The elite, and only the elite, consumed the arms and thighs of the sacrificed warriors, not out of hunger, but for power. Eating the flesh of the enemy was said to transfer their strength to you. The commoners, meanwhile, made do with corn. But what is truly disturbing about all this is that not all those sacrificed were warriors. Children were considered sacred offerings, especially to Tlaloc, the god of rain. The Aztecs believed that their tears would bring storms. Therefore, before the sacrifice, they would intentionally make them cry. Some were drowned, others burned alive. And if the child had any deformity, their value increased. It was an honor to be born with a defect. It meant you were special to die. Behind the devotion, there was also strategy. The Aztec Empire dominated dozens of regions, and those regions were obliged to send people to be sacrificed. It was a system of control, fear, spiritual and political domination. Because you didn't just lose battles, you lost your children. This is how loyalty was maintained. But when Hernan Cortés arrived in 1519, he was not alone. He brought with him all those peoples who deeply hated the Aztecs. They had seen their friends, children, and siblings die among the stones of the temple. Now they wanted revenge. In 1521, Tenochtitlan fell, and what the Spaniards saw left them marked for life. Structures with thousands of skulls, temples soaked in blood, and priests still sacrificing while the city burned. Cortés and his men were far from saints, but even they, in their brutality, decided that massacre had to end. And so, an empire sustained by human hearts was destroyed by betrayal, an epidemic, and a fire that not even the gods could extinguish. Or perhaps they didn't want to. If you lived in Sparta, as soon as you were born, a council of elders would decide if you deserved to live. It's not an exaggeration. In Sparta, life began with a judgment. And if you were weak, had a deformity, or just didn't seem strong enough, you were thrown off a cliff. Mount Taygetos was the first and last cradle for thousands of newborns. The logic was simple. Sparta didn't raise ordinary citizens, it raised human weapons. And surviving birth was not enough, because if you were male, your real hell began at age 7. At that age, boys were taken from their mothers and thrown into a state training system called agoge. And no, it wasn't a military camp. It was a killer factory. They were taught to fight, to endure pain, to go hungry, and to feel nothing. If they stole food and were caught, they weren't punished for stealing, but for failing. The message was clear. Compassion doesn't exist, only competition does. And when someone faltered, the punishment was not a reprimand, it was a public beating. Sometimes, even to the point of death. And surviving the training was no guarantee of anything. The kids were forced to fight each other with real violence, without any restrictions. The weak had no second chances. It was natural selection, administered by the state. And if you reached the age of 20, you officially became a full-time soldier. Even if you got married, you had to live in barracks with other men until you were 30. And marriage? It wasn't for love. It was to produce more soldiers. Between battles, training, and politics, there was a group that kept everything running behind the scenes. The helots were the real economic engine of Sparta. They were slaves who farmed, cooked, built, and cleaned. They represented 90% of the population. And Sparta, as you can imagine, did not have enough guards to control them all. But they did have something more effective: systematic terror. Every year, a ritual war was declared against them. The elite of young warriors would spread across the fields and kill helots at random, without reason, warning, or consequence. It was a tradition known as the Krypteia, and its sole purpose was to send a message, a reminder that the one with absolute power over rights and life was the state. It was a society without art, without commerce, and without empathy. While other Greek cities flourished in philosophy, theater, or science, Sparta invested all its resources in perfecting obedience and brute strength. There was no strong currency or monumental architecture, just discipline, fear, and war. And for centuries, it worked. Sparta earned respect, fear, and enemies. But that same system which made them invincible left them unable to adapt when the world changed. Mesopotamia. The next time you complain about a traffic ticket, remember this. In ancient Mesopotamia, forgetting a clause in a contract could cost you an eye or even your life. Because in that civilization, one of the most advanced in history, justice was not measured with scales, it was measured with knives, ropes, and blood-stained bricks. And punishments were different depending on your profession and gender. The most curious thing is that they weren't just simple, lawless savages. On the contrary, they had the first legal code of humanity, a structured and detailed system with more than 280 laws inscribed in stone. Hammurabi called it justice. But when you read their punishments, you realize that what they were looking for was a form of officialized revenge. Did you build a house that collapsed and killed someone? So you had to pay with your son's life. Did you break the bone of a noble? Then get ready. The state would come to break yours. And that was just the beginning. The punishments were creatively sadistic. There were impalements, hangings, and public mutilations. Sometimes, they would skin you alive. At other times, they would wall you up inside the walls while still breathing as a sacrifice to protect the building's structure. Some ended up being devoured by lions in front of crowds who watched not out of morbid curiosity, but as a warning. And if you think this only applied to violent criminals, you are mistaken. The list of deadly offenses included everything from medical errors to family arguments. A surgeon who failed an operation could lose both hands. A priest who made a mistake in interpreting an omen could be whipped, exiled, or directly executed. And women, of course, were not exempt from this logic. If it was suspected that a wife had committed adultery, she was cast into the Euphrates River. If she floated, she was innocent. If he drowned, well, the case was solved. Nature was the jury, the executioner, and the perfect excuse. And if that already sounds absurd, wait. Because even speaking too much could leave you without a tongue, without ears, or without freedom. Slaves were not considered human. If one of them tried to escape, the master had every right to gouge out their eyes. And if they made a mistake, regardless of their intention, they were punished in an exemplary manner, so that everyone remembered their place. You were not a person, you were property with a pulse. Even so, and here comes the contradiction that defies all logic, This same civilization was the cradle of advances that shaped the world. They invented cuneiform writing, irrigation, the concept of taxes, and bureaucracy. They built temples, cities, and systems of government that still inspire us today. But they did it with stained hands, because in Mesopotamia, civilization and barbarism were not opposites. They were partners. Over time, other cultures such as the Persians or the Greeks would soften some penalties. But the echo of Hammurabi's code continued to resonate for centuries. Even today, the famous phrase, "an eye for an eye," survives in political discussions, memes, and personal vendettas. But at least we no longer gouge out eyes with the state's permission. Or so we believe. Egypt. When you think of ancient Egypt, you probably imagine majestic pyramids, golden pharaohs, and mystical rituals under starry skies. But behind that almost romantic image of eternal civilization, there is a reality that few mention. An unhealthy obsession with the human body, taken to limits that today would seem like something out of a horror movie. Because while the West was still crawling in the field of medicine, the Egyptians were already opening up corpses as if they were divine instruction manuals. And it wasn't just about preserving, it was about experimenting, about taking apart the human body as if it were an object that could be dismantled, modified, even reprogrammed. They believed that the body should be preserved for eternal life. But to achieve it, it first had to be destroyed. The brain was removed through the nose with a hook, stirred into a mush, and extracted in pieces. The organs were removed one by one, placing them in special jars, while the body was covered with salt for 40 days. And the curious thing is that, although they were experts at handling the brain, they believed that the heart was the center of intelligence. The rest was just soft tissue. But the most chilling part is that this process was not always reserved for the dead. There are records of experimental surgeries conducted on living people, without anesthesia, without consent, only with blind faith that the gods guided the embalmer's hand. Medical texts describe practices such as drilling the skull to relieve headaches, applying crocodile dung to wounds, or pouring hot resin on burns. If something worked, it was a miracle. If not, it was divine will. And then there was royalty, because if medicine was grotesque, genetics was a nightmare. Pharaohs married their sisters, their daughters, even their nieces, in an attempt to keep the blood pure. The outcome was an endless chain of malformations, hereditary diseases, and physical deformities. The most famous case, Tutankhamun, had a clubfoot, fragile bones, a disproportionate skull, and an asymmetrical face, all courtesy of parents who were also siblings. Death, instead of freeing them, chained them even more. Many pharaohs were buried with their servants, concubines, and even animals. Not symbolically, but literally. They were strangled or buried alive so that they would continue to serve the king in the afterlife. Because in Egypt, the hierarchy did not end with life. It continued underground, and the horror didn't end there. For centuries afterwards, those same mummified bodies were looted, ground up, and sold as medicine. They called it mummy powder, a miraculous remedy that was ingested to cure diseases, enhance virility, or simply as a status symbol. It was enthusiastically consumed in Europe, without knowing or without wanting to know that they were chewing on millennial corpses. And then there were the accidents of eternity. People who were not intentionally mummified, but due to the dry conditions of their tombs, were preserved for centuries without decaying. Bodies with intact skin, visible tattoos, even hair. Death reached them, but did not completely take them away. And upon finding them, archaeologists unearthed frozen gazes of people who never thought they would be seen again. So no, Egypt was not just gold, gods, and wisdom. These were also primitive scalpels, grotesque rituals, and a morbid idea of immortality that turned the human body into the canvas of their obsessions. While they pursued eternal life, they left behind a gallery of horrors that no god dared erase. The Incas. If you were born with delicate features, a calm gaze, and obedient behavior, you were considered special, but not in the way you might imagine. For the Incas, those characteristics were a divine selection for sacrifice. Because while the empire wove roads between mountains, tamed impossible landscapes, and built fortresses without mortar, it also hid something much more disturbing: a machinery of sacred death. organized, planned, and publicly celebrated. For them, the sacrifice was an honor, a ceremony, a duty that everyone understood, except those who were to die, especially the children. Because for the Incas, purity was the most treasured quality. And no one was more pure than a child. That is why they were carefully selected from a young age, fed the best products, dressed like nobles, and treated as heavenly envoys. All so that, months or even years later, they would walk tens or hundreds of kilometers across the Andes toward their grave. That ritual, known as capacocha, was activated when an emperor died, a natural disaster occurred, or simply when the new ruler needed to validate their power before the gods. The children climbed to the most hostile heights, where the air is barely breathable, and there they were sacrificed. Sometimes, after being drugged with coca leaves and fermented chicha, they were simply left to freeze to death, alone. Sometimes they were hit on the head or strangled to ensure a quick death, or that their souls wouldn't escape in confusion. But the tragedy doesn't end there, because modern analyses, forensic scans, and tests on frozen tissues reveal something chilling. Some of those children woke up seconds before dying. After the effect of the drugs, they regained consciousness. They were lucid, fragile, and fully aware of the fate that awaited them over 5,000 meters high, surrounded by nothing but the white silence of eternal ice. And it was not only the children. The emperor's wives also had to follow him to the grave. The same happened with servants, concubines, and trusted nobles. In many cases, they were buried alive alongside the royal corpse, like an entourage for the afterlife. In the Inca view, serving your lord did not end with death, it continued in the other life, and refusing was not an option. Some subjugated tribes also practiced ritual cannibalism. It was not seen as a savage act, but as a sacred way to prolong the strength of the sacrificed warrior. His body was not wasted. He was consumed with reverence so that his power would not die, but circulate within the community that defeated him. But the most macabre thing of all was its political dimension, because these practices were not limited to the spiritual world. They were also a tool of control. The dominated regions were forced to send people for the sacrifices. It was a silent yet devastating way to remind you who was in charge. If you rebelled, you lost your land, and your children were turned into offerings. They defeated you physically and broke your spirit, and yet no one questioned it. For the Incas, dying like that was the highest honor a human being could aspire to. They called it honor. But for those who walked towards death with their feet bound and royal jewels hanging from their necks, it was a true nightmare. All that belief system, rights, and control collapsed within a few decades when the Spaniards arrived in 1532. They brought swords, fire, gunpowder, and smallpox. In the blink of an eye, the great empire that worshipped blood crumbled in the face of chaos, disease, and betrayal. But what they left behind, besides architecture and mythology, was a trail of sacrifices frozen in time and childlike faces asleep in death, with stories that we are only now beginning to understand. Don't forget to support this type of content by subscribing and watching this other very interesting video that you will love.